Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, whatever time zone you're joining us from. Thanks for joining us for this Python for Delphi developers webinar. We're doing things differently today. We're both on camera today. So joining me is Kyriakos Valos, and I'm sure I totally mispronounced your name again. You may know him as PyScripter. He developed the incredibly popular PyScripter IDE, which is an IDE developed in Delphi for Python. And he also makes a library called Python for Delphi, which is what the focus of today is going to be about how to use combine Python and Delphi, the fundamentals of this, and get the best of both worlds. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you very much, Jim. Thanks a lot. Okay, let's not waste any time. Just go straight into it. You can see the slides, I suppose. Yes. So what we'll be covering today is first of all the why you might want to mix those two languages. What is the motivation? What are the potential synergies? And then we'll just have a kind of tutorial that takes you through the basic aspects of the integration. Initially, we start with a simple demo and then show how you can actually integrate, how the two-way interaction between Python and Delphi can work. And we're going to be doing that by having a series of demos.
I'll point out that if anybody has questions, they can put them in the question panel here, and we will do our best to get them answered for you. We'll type answers, and then we will take time to discuss any questions at the end as well. So,
first of all, why should you care? Why you, as a Delphi developer, you might develop an interest in learning Python or learning how to integrate Python with your Delphi applications. Unless you live in a different planet, you would have noticed that Python has increasingly become very, very popular. It has become the language of choice for things like data analytics, machine learning, artificial intelligence, natural language processing. It is actually replacing Java as the core language in computer science degrees. So my son is studying computer science at Manchester University in the UK. From this year, the main language in the computer science courses is Python.
the interesting thing about that is it used to be that Pascal, Delphi and Pascal were really the core language of computer science. So it's progress. It went from Perl to Java. Yeah.
It comes and goes. Okay, maybe in 5 years' time it's going to be something else. Who knows?
Oh yeah.
I mean, what is the attraction for Delphi developers? Well, it is the vast number of libraries which are readily accessible via Python. That's one big selling point, which includes the data analytics and machine learning libraries, but many others as well. As you can see here, whenever there's a new version, let's say, of things like TensorFlow and so on, it's immediately made available to Python programs. Okay, so and that's a big plus. Just on the language of Python, again, there's a perception that it's actually easy to learn and fast to become productive in programming Python. And as we're going to see and demonstrate, I believe there's a great deal of complementarity between Python and Delphi, which you might be able to exploit by using Python for Delphi.
When you introduced the Python for Delphi, mentioned it to me, that was the thing that hit me, is just the idea that there's so many libraries and stuff you hear about in the news, TensorFlow, whatever, being used with Python, and just the idea that I can then take all those and use it from Delphi seems like a huge benefit. So yeah, very exciting.
Indeed. In this slide, I'm just highlighting potential uses and applications. Again, this is the top one that I mentioned there is getting access to the Python libraries, but this is not the only one. I mean, another option is to use Python as a scripting language for Delphi applications. And you may ask, why not using, let's say, Delphi or Pascal-like scripting language, which is also a possibility. Well, because the majority of the users are more likely to be familiar with Python than probably Pascal, and obviously that makes it easier for users to extend your application. A good example of that kind of use of Python in a Pascal application is an editor called CUDA text, which basically is a shell that is written in Pascal, and everything else is done via Python scripts, plugins basically written in Python. The other way around is basically you got Delphi code and you use Python, and somehow you want to make use of your Delphi code from inside Python. Another area is GUI development. For example, a mode of development might be where you do the RAD stuff and the GUI stuff in Delphi, and you do some analytic stuff in Python, and you want to package and combine all that in a single application. That would be another way. And overall, as we're going to see, we said about complementarity. You might be able to get the best of both worlds, to combine the best aspects of each language in your application development. Okay, I mean, obviously, you've seen this kind of picture before. This is the popularity index of the TIOB index for Python. What's kind of interesting is Python has been around for a long time, and its popularity went up and down, but the explosion happened in the last couple of years, really, in the last 3 years. I mean, which is kind of amazing. I mean, and the other one is the comparison to Java. Okay, I mean, like Java from the early 2000s, it was extremely popular, dropping gradually and steadily, and recently been overtaken by Python in terms of popularity. This is by using Google Trends to measure the interest over time. How does Python compare to Delphi? I mean, first of all, they have some things in common. They're both kind of old, mature, I would say. So that's a nice way of putting it. Delphi Pascal was actually introduced in 1970. The first Delphi version was in 1995. And the first Python version was in 1989. That's that's more than 30 years ago. Yeah. Okay, so Python is not new. It's kind of mature. They're both object-oriented. In fact, Python has this principle that everything is an object. There's also a meta class kind of mirroring the classes. We have meta classes. So even a class is a class of something. And multi-platform. Okay, so they're both available in multiple platforms. I would say there that Python is weak on the mobile side. So that's a strength of Delphi. But apart from that, they're all available in Mac, Linux, Windows, of course, and everything else. Mm-hmm. Now, some of the differences. I mean, one key difference is in regards to verbosity. I mean, Delphi, Pascal, it's a kind of verbose language. I mean, like begin end, you have type to delineate blocks. On the other hand, I think the innovation of Python was this indentation system. So white space is important in Python. It's used to declare the start and the end of the block, which you may hate initially, but once you like it and you get used to it, then you love it. It's actually kind of nice. Another nice thing about Python and scripting language in general is the availability of REPL. REPL stands for read, evaluate, print loop, basically like a command prompt in which you can experiment and develop incrementally the code you're writing. So testing immediately the concept into the REPL, that's actually a big plus, I would think, in development. Regarding typing, obviously Delphi is a strong static typed language. On the other hand, Python is a dynamic. They call it duck typing. Okay, so basically, if something looks like a duck and makes the same noise as a duck, then it must be a duck, or it should be considered as a duck, something like that. And in terms of memory management in Delphi nowadays is universally manual. whereas in Python, you have reference counting accompanied with the garbage collection, a kind of quite sophisticated garbage collection. Some other differences, of course, I mean, Delphi is compiled to binary code, to machine code. Python is bytecode compiled. That has implications for performance. So as we're going to see, Delphi is much faster than Python. Another limitation of Python is in relation to multi-threading. That's a limitation of many of these dynamic languages, including JavaScript, for example, and R. In Python, it's kind of hard to make use of the multiple CPUs available in today's hardware. And finally, RAG. Obviously, the strength of Delphi lies in the rapid application development and GUI development, and Python is lacking in that area. A kind of high-level introduction to what I do, if you want, Python for Delphi. This is the library, which is the focus of today's webinar. There are a number of components of the library highlighted in the slide. First of all, there is the low-level access to the Python API. Then you can have also high-level bi-directional interaction with Python, which has two components. One of them is a unit called varpyth, which allows you to directly access Python objects using the so-called custom variables in Delphi. And the second aspect is the wrapping of Delphi objects using RTTI, among other things, using the Python wrap, Delphi wrap sort of objects. Mm-hmm. And the final aspect of the library is the ability to create Python extension modules. In other words, modules which can be used in Python without having access to Delphi. So you can zip them, you can actually deploy them, and they're used directly from Python. It's an old library, Python for Delphi. It started the development back even late 90s, I would think. I took over the support of Python for Delphi for the last 15 years or so. And I developed major parts of the functionality, especially the wrap Delphi functionality. In terms of support, Unicode versions of Delphi is supported, so 2009 or later. Platform support, we have support for Windows 32, 64 bits, Linux, Delphi for Linux, and Delphi for macOS. Okay, so in addition, the library is compatible with FPC, so you could use the library with the Free Pascal compiler. The other thing is actually it's comprised mostly non-visual components, so it can be easily used not just from VCL but also FMX, and it can be used by console applications. Okay, so there's a wide range of deployment and usage scenarios. Now, just on getting started on the prerequisites, if you want. So to use Python for Delphi, Python with Delphi, you need first install Python. The main repository for Python distributions is the official repository at python.org. Another popular distribution of Python is the Anaconda distribution, which comes together with a massive library, a massive number of libraries for Python, so it saves you installing separately different libraries. It's almost 1 gigabyte inside, so it's kind of heavy. It's called Anaconda, and it would be recommended for heavy analytics work. For our demonstrations here, and we're going to be using distributions, at least initially, at least today, from www.python.org. So grab a distribution, but you may ask now, what kind of distribution? Because you got a choice there, Python 2 versus Python 3. You see underlined my recommendation. Python 2 was like the pre-Unicode version of Python. Like in Delphi, we got the pre-Unicode versions of Delphi. Nowadays, Python 2 is deprecated, is not supported. Use Python 3. And the other question is 32 bits versus 64 bits. Not much to choose from, but I would recommend using the 64-bit distributions of Python.
Now, is that tied to so like on Mac OS and Linux, you're going to be building 64-bit applications, but on Windows, if you're doing a 32-bit application, would you want to use the Python 32-bit or the 64-bit?
So you can use, let's say, 32-bit Delphi application with 64-bit Python.
Right. Okay.
So the bitness of your Delphi application need to match the bitness of the Python.
Okay.
Because basically what you're doing is you're loading a DLL, and the DLL needs to be compatible in the same sort of way. So you download and install, and then you may want, before you start laying your heads in Delphi, you may want to install some extra libraries, especially if you have a distribution for Python. And the package manager in Python is called pip. And you see an example here of how you would install from the command prompt the NumPy numerical Python library. Okay, so you may want to pre-install some of the libraries before you start playing with Delphi. Now, on the Delphi side, you can get started by either cloning or downloading the GitHub repository for Python for Delphi. My sort of recommendation would be to clone as opposed to download, because that allows you to upgrade the code by simply updating the repository. Then you need to install the components in the normal way. You see the steps there. You start RAD Studio. You add the source subdirectory to the library of Delphi, both 32 bits and 64 bits. And then you open and install. There's just one package. It's both runtime and design time package. You open it and install it, and that's about it. Okay, and now after all this introduction, well, we're going to be talking about the components, the various components of the library as we go along, as I'm going to be demonstrating those. So I'll skip that slide and go straight in our first demo, if that's okay with you, Jim.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay. I'll really start from scratch. I will create a new VCL application. Okay, and in this application, I'm going to be running Python code from Delphi and showing the output of the Python code. So I need two text controls, one for the code, one for the output. And you could use two memos for that. I'm going to be using the SceneEdit highlighting editor component for that purpose.
Like you said, they can use like a memo, but you're using SceneEdit, which gives you the nice syntax highlighting. So, yeah.
Yeah, that's right. So I'm going to put in here the SceneEdit, a splitter, be able to resize stuff, a panel where I put my buttons, and a memo. Okay, so this is my basic layout I'm going to be using, and I need a button here to run the code. And let me just call this run, the caption. And now in terms of components, let's start with the SceneEdit and the syntax highlighting. I need to add a Python syntax highlighting component. And I need to link the highlighter of the editor to that component. And SceneEdit, in fact, has something else called, which is useful. It's called Python behavior, which basically does all the automatic indentation, which is very important in Python. Okay, and now let's go to the Python components that we need to add. Here is the P4D components. And the most important one you need to know of is the Python engine. The Python engine has a number of properties, but at the moment I'm not going to be changing anything. This is the component which finds and loads the Python DLL into the Delphi space. And you can configure the version and the path of the DLL, but there's a property called use last known version, which basically will do for our purposes. It will find the latest version of Python installed automatically. So I won't be changing any properties of that. And then I'm adding the GUI stuff, Python GUI input output. This is just a component which takes the output of Python and puts it into a memo. So I need to link that to my memo, and I need to link that. I need to link the Python engine to the GUI input output. And basically, I'm pretty much all set. Okay, let me just quickly review here. We got a CNet at the top, we got a memo at the bottom, and we see here two Python components. One is the engine, which loads the Python, and the other is the GUI input output, which takes the out from the engine and puts it in the memo. I'm going to be using 64 bits here, no particular reason. So I'm adding the 64-bit platform, and I'm going to be saving all that and save the project as well. Okay, and now I'm ready to compile, to run.
Is there an option to link in the Python DLL, or does it have to be distributed separately?
We'll talk about deploy memo options. Basically, the choice is either between having a Python distribution installed in the target machine or shipping the DLL with your application. So you have that option, but you can embed the DLL in any other way. You can ship your own version of Python with your application, but that's something we might cover. And now we are ready for our Hello World program. Print, and I didn't write the code to the run. Sorry, forgot. One small detail. So get Python engine. The Python engine is a singleton object. There is one for the whole application. Get Python engine. Make sure we get this reference to the Python engine in a unique way. So I want a method called exec string, which expects a NASI string in UTF-8 encoding. So I'm going to be using UTF-8 encode of scene edit1.text, and that will do, I think. Let's just try to run again.
Python for Delphi works with the Unicode versions of Delphi, but it's expecting an ANSI string.
A UTF-8 string.
UTF-8 string.
So it's Unicode.
Okay.
Again, our print hello world run, and you see our hello world printed.
Yeah.
And that's all it takes. Okay. So this is our first demo. You can do all sorts of stuff here. For example, I can do, let's say, for I in range 2000, or let's say 200. You see the automatic indentation here?
Yep.
And run, or I can say import sys is a unit, the system unit of Python, print sys.version. So I know what is my version of Python. And it's 3.83, 64 bits, as you see here. Okay. End of the first demo. All right, so basically that was our simple demo that we had before. This is the code, runs the Python code. Next thing I'm going to be doing is I'll be demonstrating how one can use Delphi code inside Python. And I provide a couple of ways of doing that. One is more low level, the other is more high level. And I will be using this little Python code here and Delphi code to test whether a number is prime. First of all, let me just say it's totally naive. It's total crap, but it's the same in Python and Delphi, so it can be used for comparison. So this is not the point of the exercise. You can see what the code does. Basically, it takes a number, an integer number. If the number is less than 1, it returns false. Then it calculates the square root of the n, and then tests all the numbers from 1 to q, whether they are perfect divisors of n. If yes, it returns false. Otherwise, it returns true. One observation about this code you see side by side, because we talked about verbosity earlier on, Tim. You know, this code on the Delphi uses this inline variable declarations and code inference. And with inline variable declarations and code inference, the code of Delphi is almost as verbose as is not much more verbose than Python actually. So yeah. I love this feature of Delphi, introduced in Delphi URI, if I remember well. I can't remember when it was first introduced.
Yeah, so 10.3.
Yeah. Okay, so now what I'm going to be doing, first of all, let me go back to the other screen, switch screens again. So back to my Delphi. This time I'll just scrap this application. I'll open the equivalent and develop it beforehand just to make it look a bit nicer. Okay, so basically this is what we developed before, just with some couple of additions. We've got some headers there, Python source code, Python output, and so on, that don't make much difference. And the first thing I'm going to do here is I'm going to be pasting some Python code into Synedit to save me typing. The Python code I will be explaining shortly, but basically is the function you saw before, this prime, plus another function to, okay, so this is our Python code, so it is syntax highlighted here. And basically we got this isPrime method here, and another one called count primes. And then we got a test function which counts the prime numbers between 1 and 1 million. Okay, and it prints the number of primes, and then it times the execution and prints the time it takes to execute that. So we run this, and it takes a bit of time, as you can see here. It takes something like 4 seconds to do that. Okay, let me just do another run just to make sure that nothing was wrong. But
now, as far as performance goes, if you were to run this from PyScripter or some other Python IDE, the performance would be roughly the same, right?
Indeed, it's going to be exactly the same. Okay, or even from the Python prompt or whatever. Yes, it's going to be the same. Yeah. There is no overhead involved. This is a DLL you call directly, no overhead. So it is about 4.7 seconds here in Python 64 bits. You can see the number of primes. You can check it's correct by searching in the Google. It is correct.
I just have that memorized, so I know that's correct.
Really, I'm amazed. So what we're going to be doing initially is replacing this isPrime function with a Delphi function. Okay. And how do we do that? The component we'll be using is called tPython module, which basically creates a Python module in Delphi. It's automatically linked here to the Python engine. It's clever enough. And the only thing we need to provide here initially, it is a name, a module name. This is how Python will refer to this module. And we'll use the imaginative Delphi module here as the name of the module. And how do we write code? How do we really export functions? There are different ways. And I'll start with the initially seems the easiest, which is by defining Delphi events. So I define here a Python event, basically a Python function, which I call, let's say, Delphi isPrime. So it's my Delphi version of the isPrime. And to write code for that, we just write code for the onExecute event. I have this code written in an editor, so I just copy it just to save some time. This is what I showed in the slide earlier on. And then I'll copy the code used here in this event definition, and I will just talk over that. Okay, so basically, this is the way we link Delphi with Python. And the first thing that happens in this method is the conversion between the arguments received as Python objects by the function into Delphi data structures. This function here takes just one number, an integer. This is denoted by this format string I, means an integer, and then parses the Python arguments and puts them in this variable here. The address of n is this number, an integer. So after calling this function, if everything goes smoothly, we're going to have the number of the argument, the integer argument of the function into the n variable. Then we call is prime with n, and then we need to return a result. And in this case, the result is going to be either an object called pi true or an object called pi false, depending on whether the number is prime or not.
Those designs right there are just taking the result of is prime and converting it to pi true or pi false. Okay.
Indeed. So we receive the arguments in Python objects, and we need to put the result into a Python object. And finally, we need not to forget the reference counting. This is very important. One thing that can go wrong with Python code is reference counting. So we need, in this case, to decrease the reference count of the result. And let's run the code now. Now, in this case, we don't need all this is prime stuff. We're going to use the Delphi equivalent. So the way we expose the Delphi module is we say from Delphi import Delphi is prime. And then where is prime is used, we just use our Delphi version. These are all the changes it takes. We press run. And we see now that from this 40, if you remember, 4.7 seconds.
Yeah.
We are down to 0.4 seconds. So it's basically a tenfold increase.
Yeah.
Just by this little change.
Now, my understanding is most of the Python libraries, like NumPy and stuff, are written in C or C++ or something behind the scenes, so that they're native code in order to give them the performance. So Python itself is kind of a glue language that you use to glue all these natively built libraries together. Is that accurate?
It's accurate, yes. It's also prototyping, very good for prototyping and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But it's slow.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, just one little trick we're going to demonstrate here on this demo before we move on. One thing that Delphi can do and Python can't is to use all the CPUs I have available here and the threads. So one extension of this approach is going to take just 2 minutes is to go and add new event. So here we go and add another one. We call it Delphi count primes. And we add the code for that. I'm going to be, again, copying and pasting the code just to save time. I have the code here. So these are our new count primes, which uses the parallel for to do the calculations in parallel. So this is the parallel for version of the Python code. And I'm going to be using a new event definition, very similar to the previous one. So I won't be explaining that. Okay, so basically now I'm exposing a new function called Delphi count primes. And I'm going to be using that instead of the Python count primes. Sorry, just a second. What have I done wrong? Two ends. Okay, so now we don't need this prime. We don't need the count primes. And we just need from Delphi module import Delphi count primes. And here where we use the count primes, we need to use our own version of Delphi count primes. Any guess about how long this is going to take?
That is, wow.
That's about a 7-fold increase just for going parallel.
Yeah.
So from the 4 seconds we went down to 0.07 seconds. That sounds kind of good.
But yeah, this is, I think, really amazing, because as a Delphi developer using this, you can then leverage all the Python libraries, but then the parts where Python's slow, you just write it in Delphi, and all of a sudden you better than, you have a better solution than everybody else does.
Okay, so that's how we use the Python module to do stuff in Delphi and export it. You see, it's kind of low level because you need to constantly convert Python objects to Delphi structures and back to Python objects. Okay, so that's why I would call that low level. So instead of that, I will now demonstrate the high level interface between Python and Delphi. So I get rid of all these events here. I'm also deleting, this is all the code I'm keeping here, you can see it. I'm also deleting the event definitions here. I'm not going to be using those. Python module. So basically I go back to the previous version of the code. So just the Python module does nothing at the moment. And instead of writing event code, I'm going to be using wrap Delphi. Delphi wrapper, which is the kind of high-level interface between Delphi and Python. What wrap Delphi allows you to do is basically package Delphi objects, records, interfaces, types, anything you can imagine, into something that can be directly used by Python. So in this example here, I'll be wrapping this function here, count primes, as a record. So I'm going to be using, let's say, so I'm going to be using RTTI. So let me just add here system, and then I'll define a record type. So Delphi T, just a holder of records, and I'm going to be using a class function, which is going to be this count primes. Okay, so basically now I have this type. I need this record of functions. It has one at the moment, and let me just convert this. I think I'm fine now. And now, instead of writing event code or anything, all I need is to add some code in the form create event. 3 lines of code to be precise. So I go and I add an event, form create. And again, just to save some code, I will be pasting that. Okay, and let me just explain this code here. So what I have done is basically I have a record here with a class function. It could have anything else and many functions as well. So I will be exporting that Delphi functions record into a Python object. So var py equals Delphi wrap record returns a Python object, which I assign a Python name for that in the module. So I call that Delphi functions. And set var makes it available in the module namespace. And this is just bookkeeping. I decrease the reference count, so I no longer hold this object in Delphi. This is managed by Python.
Right.
And this is all it takes. Okay, let me just demonstrate this. Okay, so my Delphi wrapper is called Delphi wrapper 1. Sorry, I need to change that.
Yeah.
And the Python module is called Python module 1. So I need to change that. My Python engine is called Python engine 1. So basically, let me just.
Always picky about that spelling.
Programming language have this habit. Anyway, here we are back again, and again I can get rid of all that stuff here. And this time, my variable is called Delphi functions. So from Delphi module import Delphi functions, and here I want to use the Delphi function is the record, count primes is the method, and run, and I get something again, which is so much faster than I had before, 0.08 seconds. There is a bit of overhead in the wrapping, but it's not significant. All right, basically, as I said, wrap Delphi, this way of wrapping things using wrap record. There is a wrap for objects, wrap interface for wrapping interfaces. It's actually very powerful. I'm not going to do any live coding, but just showing you what you can do with that is going to take just 1 minute or two. This demonstrates a number of things: how you wrap GUI objects like forms. How do you provide event handlers, Delphi event handlers writing Python code, and how do you wrap other types of classes? So let's just execute it and you probably understand. It's written as a unit test Python module. So this form is generated by Python code, not in Delphi. And you can add an event handler in Python, like this is actually executing Python code, not Delphi code. Select next page, that's another event handler, go to page 3, and so on. That's a subclass form. So basically, we are subclassing a Delphi form using Python code. And it won't work if I try to close it, can close, and now it will work. That's another way of subclassing Python forms that is actually used in this program. And open dialog using Delphi code, and so on, and various other tests. I won't go through the bulk of it. Maybe we get time next time. But just to give you some idea of what you can do with this wrap Delphi functionality.
Wow, yeah, so that's great.
And basically, I think that's all we have time for today, Jim. Let me just wrap up, and then we can have a discussion after that. This is the demo 31 in the repository, if you want to play with. Great. So basically, we started by saying that there is a case for combining Delphi with Python. And I hope I made some effort to convince you that it's not a big step to take with Python for Delphi. Makes it quite easy to do the integration. So what we explored and focused so far is basically how to automate the loading of the DLL using the Python engine component, and then the one direction, how do you go from Delphi objects and methods and functions in something that's used inside Python, okay? So there's the other direction, which I hope we'll be covering in another webinar. And so we discussed about Python engine, the Python module, creating Python modules with Delphi code in Delphi, and then the Delphi wrap or wrap Delphi components, which allows you to high level wrap your Delphi objects, records, interfaces, types to make them accessible into your Python code.
Yeah. So we'll definitely do a webinar on this for sure to follow up on this. Great stuff. Now, as a Delphi developer that is like excited, what would be the next step as far as how to learn some of the basics of Python to get started with this? Is there a book you recommend?
There's a massive number of introductory tutorials. First of all, I would recommend downloading PyScripter.
Yeah,
because it provides a Delphi-like environment for IDE. I mean, obviously, it has some ideas from Delphi in terms of how it's developed. And then in terms of tutorials, in fact, there are many which are based they're using PyScripter as I think there is one called Think with Python 3 or something that is using PyScripter as the main IDE. But there is massive number. I mean, there isn't a single one I can recommend, but it depends on the liking. Yeah.
So there is a lot of questions here. I have been trying to answer them as we go along, but I will try and field some to you that I wasn't able to answer. if somebody wants to redistribute this, and we did touch on this briefly, how do they redistribute Python? Is there just a single DLL? How big is that DLL for a Windows distribution if they want to redistribute it?
Okay. As I said, there are many options. The two main options is to install a standard distribution of Python in the target machine, in the user machine, in the client machine, and then let Python for Delphi find the installed distribution automatically. And the alternative is to ship your own version of Python with your application. And a good choice for that is a kind of minimal distribution provided by python.org called Embedded Python, which basically has the bare basics. It all depends on whether you expect the users to be installing their own units into Python. If you expect the users to be doing general Python work, installing their own units, then the first choice is much better. If on the other hand, you can package yourself everything that is going to be ever needed, then you can follow the second route. I mean, either way. So Python for Delphi can work in either of those two scenarios.
Yes, I just checked, and the minimum embeddable version here for Windows is about 8 megabytes. So
indeed, that's roughly how much. It's the minimum you need to package with your application. But as I said, you don't have to. I mean, obviously, you can ask the users to install their own versions of Python.
Yeah. And now, let's say you wanted to use a specific set of libraries in your application, set of Python application libraries.
You could package those as well.
You could package it. Okay, that's what I was going to ask. Perfect. That's what I wanted to know. Now, what about threading? Specifically, if you're working with a database or a web server. So if you're calling Python from a multi-threaded solution, are you able to handle that? Okay.
Yeah. In fact, the more general question is, how do you run Python code in your Delphi application without blocking your main thread? Which is really the key question, yeah. That's one of the topics I was planning to cover in our next webinar, Jim. But just a quick answer now, the P4D includes a component called tPython thread, which is a subclass of tthread, which allows you to do just that. I will be doing a demonstration in our next webinar of that. So yes, you can do that. You can handle the scenario, Jim. So you can do all sorts of Python stuff without having to block your main thread.
Yes. All right. I figured you could. What about exceptions or errors? So if there's an error, whether it be a syntax error or some other type of error that's raised in your Python code, how does the Delphi?
Yeah. The component Python for Delphi traps all Python errors and converts them into corresponding Delphi errors, exceptions. So basically, you will see all Python errors translate into Delphi exceptions. So you have to deal with those in the standard way.
Okay, fantastic. I need to implement a listener for Firebase. I was unable to install Python and library, but I couldn't leave. I was able to install Python library, but I couldn't leave the Python code running. So I guess they could have the Delphi application running and then it could launch the Python code?
I'm not sure I understand the question really. What is exactly
that? So they need to implement a listener for Firebase. I was able to install Python and the library, but I couldn't leave the Python code running. So I guess if Firebase would need a way to, I guess if you can't leave the Python code running, then you need to have something else that launches the Python code to respond. So I think that's a Firebase, something on the other side.
You have a Python thread in Delphi monitoring the database and triggering with synchronized triggering events in the Delphi side. And you can always interrupt in the end whenever you want the Python thread. Again, that's something we will cover in the next session, how you do that. But you got various scenarios. Of course, Firebase, I think you can use from FireDuck or or from Delphi side directly, I would think. But if you want to do that via Python, yes, I don't see any major issue.
Now, in the next session, we're also going to talk about some of the libraries you can use. Is there any limitation about which Python libraries you can use with Python for Delphi?
The short answer is no.
Okay. I like that short answer.
And there is no long answer.
How does Python, and there's no long answer. How does Python know where to find the Delphi module?
Well, remember we are running Python from inside our Delphi application. We're talking about the demos I did, yes? I mean,
so yeah,
I suppose, yes.
Yeah.
So basically, we have full control of the Python environment. So we can do whatever we want with that. We can actually add new modules. We can add things to the namespace of Python. Okay. We'll talk in the next webinar about writing Delphi Python modules that can be used without Delphi. Okay, that's something again we'll cover in the next webinar. But for the time being, all I was demonstrating is how do you integrate Python inside your Delphi code. So basically, then we have full control. All we are doing basically is we're adding the module name into the namespace of Python using low-level Python API. And we are creating in Delphi a Python object which we're passing to the Python library.
Okay.
But all this done in a kind of low-level API of Python, which we use as a DLL, a dynamic link library, in our application.
Okay. There's a few questions here about if you can use Python for Delphi with C++ Builder.
There is no reason why you shouldn't, yeah. But I'm not actually using C++ myself. So I wouldn't tell you how you do it. It's a Delphi component, and like I guess all other Delphi components, they can be used by C++ Builder.
Yeah. So yeah, exactly.
So the answer is supposed to yes, but I have no experience of doing that.
A lot of feedback. Everybody really enjoyed the presentation. Let's see. It would be interesting to see the output for a Delphi object reference, for example, print type reference, print dir reference, or print help reference.
Say it again, Jim. I'm not sure I understand the question.
So the question is, if you passed a Delphi reference into Python and then printed the type, had Python print the type of that reference.
Yeah, I mean, shall we do that and see? I mean,
sure. Yeah.
Let me just try to find the.
So yeah, the comment here about the showing the performance differences, but really, so the next session we're going to talk more about how to access like TensorFlow and stuff. But
yes, indeed, yes, and visualization libraries and everything.
Yeah, but really the advantage of combining Delphi and Python is you can take the things Delphi is good at and take the things Python is good at, and then combine the two together, right? So if you want to,
sorry,
there's an example of how it handles errors. People were asking.
Indeed. Let me just try again. That's what you see. Can you see my screen?
Yes. Yep. Module, Delphi module.
And basically, if I say print Delphi module dot count primes, I can is prime maybe this version Delphi count primes. I can't remember which version of the code I'm using, but is prime Okay, and that's now what you see, built-in function Delphi prime.
If you do print type and then the reference, or
and if I do type of that, print type, it's a built-in functional method, basically, which is the standard type for methods written in C or external code, basically. Okay. It's a real code, but yeah, it says somebody asked, I was going to do that. Also, your Python methods can have a doc string, as we call it in Python, documentation. I didn't bother to do this time, but you could have, you can say help. For example, this thing here. And then you'll see a help string associated with that. Or print the way you see the documentation for functions and everything is the doc string, as they call it in Python. So all of this could work as they work with standard Python, yeah? Let me just hide my screen, stop sharing. Have I stopped sharing?
No, still sharing.
Do you still see my screen?
Yes, I still see your screen.
Stop showing screen. Okay, this is that. All right. Any other questions? Let me answer the previous question in a more general way. The Python objects you create in Delphi are first-class citizens of the Python ecosystem. So they look and behave exactly the same way as the Python objects developed in C or C++, or the built-in types and everything else.
Yeah, that was the thing I realized as you're doing this, is that that what you're essentially doing is you have created a bi-directional bridge between Python and Delphi, because like I mentioned this at one point that all the Python libraries are written in typically in C for performance reasons.
Not all, but all the analytic stuff and everything that needs to run fast is written in C and C++. Yes.
So what you're doing is just making it so that you can
do something similar here, but using Delphi.
Yeah, exactly. Delphi Python Docker would be interesting.
Yeah, sure.
Will there be an example of matplotlib via the Delphi in the second webinar?
I got some very nice demos to demonstrate, actually. Yes, indeed. And we'll see how you can convert the output into SVGs or show the output through through browsers. So yes, we'll do a lot of that next time.
Yes, so Miguel points out, it says Python for Delphi is not a cross-compiler of Python and Delphi. Instead, it's a project designed for simultaneous coexistence of Delphi with Python in either direction. Yes, that would be.
The answer is yes.
You could think of it as a bridge that allows you to make the two work together.
Indeed.
Which is fantastic. So as far as part 2 goes, I added a second session to the webinar session. So if you are registered for part 1, which everyone live right now is, if you're catching this in the replay, there should be a link somewhere around here. Register for it and you'll get access to part 2. And you will get, so if you're already registered, you are registered for the next part. We realized this was going to be more than we could do in a single session, and based on the amount of interest we've had, I'm looking to do some additional things, whether I have you involved or not. It'd be great if you are, but I realize you're very busy too. So, but I will definitely try to add some additional resources around this and as well. So.
Jim, I mean, we can make the source code available as well.
Yes,
I've seen you make the slides
I put the
available.
source code in the chat link. I'll put it in here again so anybody can download the source code. Someone was reporting that Chrome is suspicious of the link, but it works from Firefox, and you should be able to bypass the warning from Chrome. I couldn't put the source code in the handout system. I had to put it as a link, so I'll put it on a blog post as well, though.
And another question is, will the recording be available for later watching?
Yes, the recording will be available on the blog post that goes with this website or with this webinar, which I'll put the link in the chat there, which is at blogs.embarcadero.com, Python for Delphi developers webinar. What about documentation? Is there, if they go to the GitHub page, is there documentation there that walk through?
There are some wiki pages, but the basic documentation is the demos. There's 34 demos taking you through all the various steps. And I guess these webinars are going to be further documentation.
Yeah.
But there is no other, I'm afraid, there's no much other help you get. But you get a vast range of demos that we can explore and play with.
Okay, is it possible to return a Delphi from a Delphi function a string to the Python output?
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Is it possible to set a particular virtual environment created by Conda?
Indeed, you can use virtual environments as opposed to distributions. And Python for Delphi makes it easy to use virtual environments. Again, this is something we'll cover a little bit next time in the next webinar. How do you use specific distributions of Python, registered or unregistered, like the virtual environments? But yes, the answer is yes.
Okay.
And Venv, VirtualEnv, or Conda environments you can actually use. Venv is the built-in Python virtual environments. VirtualEnv is another popular way of creating environments, and of course, Conda is the Conda way of creating virtual environments. And Python for Delphi could work with any of those.
Should I comment here? I last worked with Delphi in 1995. Python for Delphi is a good return to Delphi. I'm really excited about this because, and I think I mentioned this earlier, is that there's so many interesting things going on with Python right now, especially with the libraries like TensorFlow, machine learning, and stuff like that. But when you look at like trying to create a GUI application with Python, it's like really archaic. And so the ability that I can take and combine the strengths of Delphi with the libraries of Python is really, really exciting. So yeah.
And I don't know whether we're closing down, but before we close down, let me just say that I've got some really nice stuff for the next webinar. So I've already sort of done most of the preparation. So don't miss the next one.
Right, I'm looking forward to it. Can you pass a Python list into Delphi?
Of course. You could create Python lists very easily. Again, that's part of the demos we're going to have next time. Pass it back, NP arrays, anything you want. Yeah, there is no limit.
So
and at very high level, you can iterate through Python lists using the for in Delphi syntax. So you can access them in a very high level way. But more of that next time. Yes, indeed.
So there's a question here about mobile. Python doesn't run on mobile yet, but I'm assuming if Python did work on mobile, in theory, Python for Delphi could be made to work on mobile.
Yeah, I mean, there was just no opportunity to do that. There's some users asking for that lately. Android, for instance, is just it's very close, similar to Linux. So I just didn't have the time or the reason to do that. But in principle, it wouldn't be that hard to translate, to use the same library. It should be compatible to a very large extent.
It's a request here to put Python for Delphi in the Get package manager. I'm certainly happy to do that. You're okay with that, right?
Say it again.
To add Python for Delphi into the Get package manager in the IDE.
Oh yeah, sure. You have no problem with that. Yes.
Yeah, and so there's a few questions here about more information, more training and stuff. So I said we're going to have another webinar on this. So the response to this webinar has been phenomenal, really, the amount of interest. So I'm looking at options as far as how to make more training and more resources around this so that we Embarcadero can support the community and you. So I'm not asking you to make all this training, but we will try to find some ways to make some training collaborating with you. So just so everybody knows, there is more resources and more training coming around this. We're doing our best to support the project and support you. So
thank you, Tim. That sounds good.
Can I access database objects like the client dataset from Python?
Yes.
Now, if you're doing database access,
by the way, there is, just to say on that, there is a wrapper for FireDuck. So basically, the whole FireDuck is wrapped in and can be used directly from Python. Okay, there is a demo. I couldn't fit it for the next time, but you can find a demo in the repository as well. So yes, you can do whatever you want.
If a few people are asking how many people are attending, we don't usually announce that, but I will just say it is a lot. Probably 2 or 3 times as much as we usually see in webinars. So like I said, clearly something a lot of interest is in. Can Delphi be used from Python in the other way than Delphi project module compiled into DLL?
Yes, again, that's is going to be demonstrated in the next tutorial. You can use the whole VCL from Python without Delphi.
Wow.
Can you imagine creating forms in Python code without touching Delphi?
Now, if I understand correctly, I could use Delphi and create my IDE or my web form, and then just instantiate that form and interact with that form from Python, right?
Even better, you can create your form in Python. You don't need to.
Oh, okay. Yes, it will work with Delphi Community Edition and Academic Editions. Not yet on Android and iOS. So much to cover, you need 3 people, or you need a part 3, people want more. Yeah, so like I said, we will have another one in 2 weeks, and then we were looking to add more. Actually, I just had a meeting with Otnus, and he's like, okay, next quarter, I want you really focused on the Python for Delphi stuff and what we could do around that. So, all right, I'll be learning a lot more about Python. It's one of those things, I knew a little bit about Python, but I haven't really had a lot of need to use it, I guess. But now I guess I do. So.
In fact, today we didn't talk very much about the stuff we can do with Python, actually. So next time we'll spend more time looking at Python libraries and how you integrate them and you use them from Delphi.
So here's a question: the Python for Delphi project, are there other developers that are helping with that, or is it primarily you, or how much effort is involved in that?
It has a long history. There were some brilliant programmers involved in that. I took over by a Canadian guy called Morgan Martinez, if I remember well. But for the last 15 years, I've been looking about that. There is a kind of mirror project for Python for FPC, and there is another guy looking after that, and we work together quite often. And then at various points, there are various contributors. But the answer is that the main developer of the library is myself. Has been myself for 15 years now.
Okay. So yeah,
let me say that there have been sponsors over time. I don't know whether Lawrence Liu is here. Lawrence has sponsored the development of the Linux and Mac OS ports of Python for Delphi. Okay, so there are other people supporting the project either financially or through sort of contributing through bug reporting, issue reporting, pull requests, and so on. But if anybody wants to contribute, that I would be absolutely delighted.
Okay, I will certainly look for ways I can help contribute, and hopefully we'll see some other people helping contribute as well. So question here says, I use Python on AWS. Can I use a Delphi module there?
This is the Amazon stuff?
Yeah, on Amazon.
What is the user scenario here in Visits? I can understand exactly what the user is asking.
I'm guessing that they're using Python on AWS, possibly hosted on AWS or with Lambda or something like that, and they're wanting to call a Delphi module or module they wrote in Delphi from there?
Well, if you deploy the Delphi module in the server, then yes, you can actually, I suppose. But I guess the server is running Linux, so you have to have the Delphi for Linux component. But that's something we'll cover next time. So you'll see how you can develop something in Delphi and then use it from Python independently of Delphi, whether that's in Linux, Windows, or macOS, it doesn't matter.
Okay. So question here, a couple questions. How can we help? Do you want just people to submit pull requests, or do you want them to discuss proposals of things they'd like to do, or what's the best way to go about helping?
Well, anything. At the moment, there is an outstanding issue in the repository, which is to convert the demos from Python 2 to Python 3. So if anybody wants to play with the demos, convert them, make a pull request, that would be great. It's a good first time issue, basically.
Okay.
Because you learn about the components. It's a relatively easy job to do.
So the question here,
any of those ways, pull requests, ideas, suggestions, bug fixing or bug reporting, writing documentation is another area that people can help. Expanding the wiki pages of the repository, for example.
It says, excellent, what I wanted to propose. Fantastic. Oh gosh, I'm trying to keep up here. Foyer says 15 years of Delphi usage, 10 years of Python usage. Thanks for the great job. Yeah, this is great. Oh, does reference counting management have to be manual? Can future versions of Python for Delphi library automate this?
Automate reference counting. They have already. If you use the high-level components, you can forget about reference counting. That's we'll cover also next time with the var pipe unit. But you need to know nothing about reference counting if you use the high-level access.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see. Do you think you replaced tkinter?
Tkinter is the graphics library of Python, the kind of basic library. Yeah. Yes, I mean, obviously, one usage scenario is instead of, let's say, doing graphics with tkinder, which look awful, to do them with Delphi. Yeah, that's one of the usage scenarios. Not the only one, but it is one of the usage scenarios.
Yeah, now that you mentioned that, was when I went and looked at GUI development with Python, I remember seeing tkinder, and I was like, oh. What if you have an error from the Delphi side that goes to Python? So Python's calling into a Delphi module and an error happens. How do you handle that on the Python side?
You see a Python exception.
Okay.
And you can create exception types in Delphi. So you raise tailored Python exceptions when that happens. There's demos demonstrating that. In fact, this last demo 33, does that as well.
So as far as the difference between the high-level components and low-level components, the high-level components use RTTI, so there's a little bit of overhead from that. But the low-level components just give you the ability to be more concise if you want to have better control of it and remove the bit of RTTI overhead. Is that accurate?
Well, we just saw here the integration going from Delphi to Python, using from Python code developed in Delphi. We haven't seen the other way around. And the other way around is using custom variants as the implementation. Okay, so, and as far as the wrap Delphi stuff is concerned, it can use RTTI as the last choice. Basically, the library already wraps a number of different, let's say, VCL components, string list, and everything, without necessarily using RTTI, which actually makes it faster, because the RTTI route is the slowest route. So basically, wrap Delphi is using a mixture of RTTI as the last resort. If something has not been wrapped otherwise, then RTTI is used. But it does actually custom wrapping of a large number of commonly used Delphi objects.
When I compiled demo 1, it shows an error, could not open DLL Python 32 DLL. Okay, so I will add if you go to the blog post with this, I will put some more. Let me put the link here for the blog post. I'll put more explicit
just
steps.
to remind the users 2 things here. First of all, you need to install Python. Second, the bitness of Python needs to match the bitness of your Delphi application. So you install 32 bits Python, you need to use 32 bits Delphi. You install 64 bits Python, then you need to match this with the 64 bits Delphi. You can install both 32-bit and 64-bit Python, and they can coexist without any issues. And the last thing here is, don't forget to set use the latest version of Python in the Python engine component. And I'm pretty sure Delphi will find your Python installation.
Okay. So people have to go. Oh wow, I didn't realize how late it was. There's a question coming here: can I debug Python code from Delphi?
It's a good question. Not readily. You can use the Delphi ID to debug your Python code. What you could do while you develop your Python code, you can use another ID like PyScripter, for instance, to debug your Python code. When you make sure it works, then you bring it back. But you can debug the stuff that takes place in Delphi. For example, if you write a routine, you export it to Python, you can put a breakpoint inside your Delphi code, which is used by Python.
Right.
But the Python itself, the answer is you can't debug it, no.
Okay, I think we're going to have to go here just because it's so late and we've gone through so much. But yeah, so please join us next time. I will put some more information, links on the blog post, which I put in the chat there for everybody. Thank you so much, Kyriakos, for this.
Thank you guys for attending. Okay, that's very nice to have this large audience.
Yeah, great stuff. Great. Thank you, everybody, for being here and for showing interest and for being involved. And we will see you all next time.
Thanks very much.
Bye, everybody.